Hi, Jody. Sukasa.
The thing is, all the other ones that you've done have been so good that now I don't want to miss when you teach.
Yeah, okay.
He is good.
So good, right?
Sukasa, I will thank you. I did see the note that you sent a week or two ago, and that was very sweet. Thank you.
What, to the temple?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Merle. I miss seeing you on
Hello.
Tuesdays.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good.
Merle,
Yes.
your dad was a physician?
My father, who is that? My father was a studio physician when he first got out of medical school.
Oh, really? Oh, that's why you said a lot of them were his patients.
And then when all the studios started opening up, they stayed as his patients in his office and many times in our home.
So what was his specialty?
Cardiology and internal medicine.
And what was your maiden name?
Immerman.
Okay. All right, because my father was a pulmonologist.
Oh,
And
okay.
and he was, might be at the same age.
Well, Carl was 92 when he passed away, and that was in 92.
Wow.
And my father was 92 when he passed away in 99. And I'm sorry to take up the time, Rabbi. We're paying Jewish geography. But I know they knew each
My
other.
uncle was a surgeon, Stanley Immerman.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started because I'm conscious of the time. And I'm also teaching at 1 o'clock, so I've got to catch up on that as well. One of those mornings running from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom. And I realize that I don't.
You don't have to go far.
Right, exactly. But I realize that I don't have what I have in non-COVID land, which is a waiting room with an assistant to schmooze with people and offer them an espresso while I'm running. They're stuck wondering why they can't get into the Zoom room. So we're going to get it and talk about one of my favorite topics and things to talk about, which is in essence what I would call American Judaism, because the landscape of Judaism in America is, I think, unique in the spectrum of Jewish history. Never has anything existed like what Jews have experienced for the last 360-ish years in America. And it also has resulted in expressions of Judaism that I think are also in many ways uniquely American. So kind of as a means of introduction, I suppose, I think we often have this idea that once upon a time in the good old days, there was just Judaism. And right, there weren't these movements or what are actually, I would say, even more accurately denominations, but I think we think of denominations as being a Christian word, even though it's not, right? But there weren't Reform Jews, and there weren't Conservative Jews, and there weren't Reconstructionist Jews, and there weren't Renewal Jews, and there weren't Secular Humanist Jews, and there weren't Modern Orthodox Jews, and there weren't Ultra-Orthodox Jews, and there weren't Chabadniks and Aish Torah people and all of this mushigas, right? They were just Jews. That's true. We didn't have all those names for different expressions of Judaism. And they were all just Jews. But this idea that at any point in Jewish history, going back to Abraham, much less Moses, the idea that Judaism was ever monolithic is a myth. The idea that there was ever a time, for starters, in which Jews agreed on everything is a myth, right? But a time in which Jews all did, practiced, observed Judaism more or less the same is bunk, to put it simply. Right? There have always been a wide variety and a spectrum of ways in which Jews practiced or didn't practice Judaism, what Jews believed and didn't believe. We just may not have had names or buckets for them the way we do in now the 21st century, right? It was never monolithic. There have always been different ways. It's just really in the last, I'd say 150 years really, that we have these categories, which I think actually create sometimes more challenges or problems than, or divisions than benefits, right? And these categories, and we'll talk about this in a minute, particularly today, I think, in large part are the result of institutions, not so much the result of individual Jews or even individual Jewish communities, right? And I'll say more about kind of these large institutions, which are for the most part creations of the middle of the 20th century, 1940s, 50s, 60s, that kind of dominate the Jewish landscape, and which is some of the reason I think we have these large movements, or in some ways I can say had these large movements. So we're going to go back not that far, right? To the last thing I'll say is that, well, no, I'll get there in a second. We're going to go back to 19th century Europe, which is the sort of I would almost say like what are they called? Like tidal pools, right? Sort of like germination space for what become two of the uniquely American expressions of contemporary Judaism, being the Reform and the Conservative movements. Because what you have happening in Western Europe, for the most part, in the 19th century, right, is this sort of, particularly in Germany, Jews kind of living a very bourgeois life, having financial success, being a part of the educated classes, being a part of much of German society, and looking for ways to express their Judaism in a way that is not in conflict with this German European lifestyle in which they love and are very much a part of. And so the Reform movement takes its roots from this 19th century German experience of saying, we believe that we can be, fully German, full-fledged participants in German civic life and society, and we can be Jewish, and those things are not in conflict with one another. Right? Which to this day, I think in many ways is a hallmark of the Reform ideology, and we'll get to that in more depth in a bit. I'm going to come to conservative in a moment, right? But it is not until Reform Judaism makes its way across the Atlantic and to the U.S. that it really starts to grow and have this opportunity to really flourish, because you have all these things happening at once, which is immigration, right, and this whole group of new Jews immigrating to the U.S. who are looking for expressions of Judaism, but also looking for ways to be welcomed into and assimilate into this new American society in which they're embracing. And traditional modes of Judaism, maybe didn't seem so compatible with that. What happens at this point, though, in the 19th century in Germany, as this reformation, right, reforming how Judaism can be practiced in a modern way starts to take place, is what happens in, I think, all sorts of situations in which the status quo is being changed, which is you then have other folks who say, whoa, hang on. What are you doing here? Right? Don't be messing with this. No. And so as a response to these German Jewish reformers, you have other folks circle the wagons and double down on more traditional forms of Jewish practice, and thus, in essence, birth what today we call Orthodox Judaism, right? The story is not, as many of us imagine it, that like Orthodox Judaism is this, true Judaism strand from Moses at Mount Sinai, and Reform Jews are the crazy Jews that just break off because they want to do more liberal things. It's Orthodoxy crystallizes as a response to the Reform Jews trying to change the way Judaism was being expressed. Jeff, I see your hand. I'll get you in just a second. Right? Here in the US, right, you have these Reform Jews who are desperately trying to to, again, find ways that Jews can assimilate and be a part of American society and still be Jewish. And you know, in there's a famous event in 1883, the Hebrew Union College, which is the Reformed seminary, ordains its first class of rabbis, and they in Cincinnati, and they have a big dinner, a big banquet to honor these newly ordained rabbis. And it has since become known as what's called the Treifa banquet, because they blatantly served treif. They served, I have a copy of the menu somewhere, actually, I forget, but there was, I want to say it was a shrimp cocktail and a lobster thermidor on the menu. And there's all sorts of interesting debate, by the way, as to whether or not the caterer just screwed up or whether or not it was this intentional, like, thumbing their nose at it, right? We'll probably never know. But of course, there's backlash and eruption in other parts of the Jewish world, here in the US. And this is sort of crystallized even further. In 1885, the Reform movement adopts the Pittsburgh platform, the first sort of platform of Reform movement. And there's a famous line in it in which they articulate that all such Mosaic rituals, such as ritual dress and dietary practice and all these sorts of things, are foreign and kind of dispensed with. And that is what lays the foundation for what we now refer to as classical Reform Judaism, where, you know, Edgar Magan famously would kick people out of the sanctuary if they were wearing a talit, much less a kippah, right? Or, you know, God forbid, any aspect of kashrut, because that comes from this place of, you know, 1885 and this group of Jews really wanting to be fully American and really wanting to be accepted by the majoritarian American culture and society. So here's where conservative kind of starts to enter the picture. Two kind of differences of opinion as to sort of what really was the beginning of the conservative movement galvanizing itself. The Jewish Theological Seminary, which becomes the primary seminary for the conservative movements, founded the next year in 1886. So some people talk about the conservative movement trying to, quote, conserve Judaism and save Judaism from these, you know, crazy, you know, Reform Jews who are just mucking it all up and throwing out the baby with the bathwater and all of that. What I think is actually, I think that's probably part of it. What is actually, I think, a more accurate historical picture of the birth anyway, the genesis of the conservative movement, is that it also comes from 19th century Europe and was an attempt to make 19th century European Orthodox Judaism more American and more contemporary and more palatable to another wave of immigrants from Europe who found, you know, this Orthodox European style of Jewry to be a little bit too restrictive. And here was this opportunity to also kind of in America create a more liberal, not as far as Reform, but more liberal kind of view of how that works. We'll pause for a couple of questions and thoughts, and then we're gonna jump back a couple hundred years, which might seem odd. Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
I just had to unmute, sorry. You know, I have no objection to starting this discussion with the adjectives that you've already described for each sect of Judaism as we know it today and its history. But I think the most important definition that needs to be brought out and the kernel, the real meaning of what is a Jew? What is Jewishness? What is the important, you know, you strip away elements of what we would consider the Jewish ethic and the Torah and the different elements for the different sects. But what's left is, what do we really think a Jew is? And what is Judaism to the individual? Look at this group of people. Everybody here has a different definition of what a Jew is and what a Jew is to be. Yet, is there a kernel? Is there something that's the absolute minimum? We know we should strive for the maximum, but that's difficult for all of us, I'm sure. But what is a Jew? We have what is not.
I'll briefly answer, at least in my opinion, but I'm going to push back and say that what is a Jew is an entirely different conversation, an entirely different class that I think we should absolutely offer, but I don't think is really the germane to the conversation we're having today. And I think that, as you point out, Jeff, we all have different answers, and I think there are many different answers as to what is a Jew, right? And an age-old question that has been asked and never really answered is, right, what is Judaism? Is Judaism a religious tradition? Is Judaism a race? Is Judaism an ethnicity? Is Judaism a nationality? Is Judaism a civilization? Is Judaism, which we will actually speak about when we talk about Reconstructionist Judaism, right? What is Judaism? And the answer is sort of yes and no to all of those things, right? And I think part of the reason we're all actually here is because we have different answers to these questions, and that allows Judaism to have a little bit of an open tent and have all sorts of different folks gravitate toward different aspects of Judaism. And I think that also speaks to these different expressions of Judaism and Jewish practice. I want to take us back to 1654, okay? 1654, back before any of these movements, because that is in many ways where the American Jewish story begins. It's not the first Jews coming to America in 1654. Jews had come prior to that. But 1654 is really the first time that Jews come to America and stay and don't leave. And America, and this is kind of where I began, America presents a radically different environment for Jews than had ever existed at any point or period in Jewish history. And that radically different environment is how we end up with all of these different movements able to flourish in the US. And that different environment stems from the fact that the US was Jews come to America, and it's the first time in Jewish history that Jews were, I shouldn't say in Jewish history, the first time in modern Jewish history, in which Jews were citizens of the country, of the nation in which they lived, right? As assimilated, as bourgeois, as wealthy, as politically connected as those Jews in Germany in the 1850s were, they weren't really German, they were Jewish, right? Same in France, right? So you can think you're as, bourgeois and German or French or Swiss as everybody else, but at the end of the day, if your passport says Jewish, you're Jewish. And that bakes in this sort of second class, almost on some level, kind of status for Jews. I apologize if somebody with a leaf blower outside my window. The reality of teaching from home, right? It's either the kid crying across the hall or the gardener outside with the leaf blower. So what happens is Jews come to America, and for the very first time, they're Americans, just like everybody else. And that does two things. It creates the opportunity that leads to the unbelievable and unrivaled, unmatched success that Jews have enjoyed and had in America for 360 plus years. Created, it's the reason that Jews are the most successful, most educated, minority class in the country. And it creates a challenge, which is for the first time in Jewish history, Jews have the opportunity to not be Jewish. Yeah, Roy, just a sec. For the first time in America, Jews have the opportunity to assimilate and simply, blend into the melting pot that is America and be washed away. And that dichotomy, from my perspective, one guy's opinion, is sort of that tension is sort of what I think frames the American Jewish experience, right? Is the fact that Judaism becomes this volitional thing that we get to actually choose how and how much we want to engage in. Yeah, Roy. Roy?
No, I got it. I'm just unmuting.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you touch on Napoleon's emancipation? And that sort of, my understanding, sort of kick-started gave lead to the reform movement ultimately. But did American Judaism then also affect trends in Europe?
Did American Judaism affect trends in Europe? For the most part, I would say it was sort of a one-way migration of kind of European beginnings of European progressive Jewish thought to the U.S. that coincided with larger immigration trends. So I think that, right, this tension is huge because suddenly you have this concern, which is, okay, if we can suddenly assimilate, if we can wash away into the American landscape, what do we do? How do we ensure that our children, much less our grandchildren or great-grandchildren or what have you, will still be Jewish, whatever that means, Jeff. If somebody asks them if they're Jewish, they answer yes. By the way, just as a quick aside, there's something called the National Jewish Population Survey every 10 years, Jody? Yeah, 10 years. 10 years, they do this survey, the Jewish community, and they ask a bunch of questions. And the way they define Jew is literally your phone rings, you pick it up. If you say yes to the question, are you Jewish? You count. Okay. So that probably includes some people that aren't Jewish, but that consider themselves Jewish. Okay. That's a whole other thing, right? Sukas, I saw you just dropped something in the chat. Ooh, yeah. The Americanization of Jewish names that went on in the early 20th century, that doesn't seem to happen now. Well, there's 2 points to that, right? One is this idea that Jews moved to America, right? All these names we think about, like my grandfather, like Irving, Herbert, Eugene, right? That we think of as these like typical like Alta Jewish names now, right? None of those are Jewish names, right? Those were aristocratic European names that Jews gave their kids as an attempt to help them assimilate. The irony is nobody else gave their kids those names, so it didn't work, right? If you're speaking about the Americanization of surnames during immigration, there's debate, by the way, as to whether or not it's true that, somebody would show up at Ellis Island or pre-Ellis Island, and whether the guy you putting your name in the book would shorten it from, Schwarzenbergstein, to just Schwartz, or if, the immigrant himself would simply shorten their name when giving it, right? And I don't know how much of that was really about trying to be less Jewish and how much of that was really about something that people could say and something that was just more easy to pronounce. Certainly we know in certain areas of business and certainly in the entertainment industry, people have changed their names to be a little less notably Jewish, but yeah, you meant the last names. In some cases related to anti-Semitism for sure, but I think that's actually a little bit later. A little bit later for sure, right? So we have this tension, right? How do we make sure that our kids, grandkids, great-grandkids are still Jewish? Okay. And that's where I think we start to see very clear differences in what become these Jewish movements, which is in how that question is answered, right? My operating thesis / bias is that all Jewish institutions, Judaism in the United States is trying to answer that question. What do we do so that 3 generations from now, our kids are still Jewish? Now, we all have very different answers to that question, but we're all trying to answer the same question in very different ways. So I'm going to talk about, I guess I'll do it together. So to a certain extent, overly simplify, but I'm hesitating because I was about to say the Orthodox answer. And before I do that, I should qualify it and say that the Orthodox world is not monolithic. It is a spectrum. The entire Jewish world is a spectrum, right? So there's a wide variety of differences, certainly within the Orthodox world, between modern Orthodoxy and more, traditional, we would say, forms of Orthodoxy. I think that the traditional Orthodox answer, in essence, to how do we keep our kids Jewish and their kids Jewish, is through isolation, in essence, right? Majoritarian secular American culture and society is a threat to Judaism, to Jewish identity, and to Jewish continuity. And so the way we keep our kids Jewish is we create our own insular community and only engage with the broader outside community when necessary. Commerce, business, right, what have you, right? By no means do even the most ultra-Orthodox Jews live solely within their communities, right? But again, we have our insular community, right? Our kids are not on social media. They're not reading secular books. They're not, right? And again, this is more true the further to the right you get in the Orthodox world, right? Fascinating, Jody, you're going to correct me, please, but fascinating Netflix documentary called, what's it called?
One of Us.
One of Us, thank you, which follows, I think it's 3, basically formerly very, ultra-Orthodox Jews who choose to leave their community. And it's fascinating for a number of different reasons. But one particularly telling piece is a young man who leaves the community, and he talks about the fact that he's like 17, I think. He literally knows nothing other than like Torah, Talmud, Gemara, like nothing. He gets a job bagging groceries at a store because he doesn't know he doesn't know what my 4-year-old already has learned in the school, right? And she goes to a Jewish school, right? But like he knows nothing, doesn't know about history, doesn't know about math, doesn't know about anything. And that's one way to keep people, engaged in the community and engaged in Jewish identity. Then you have on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps, the Reform answer, which has always been, well, no, we don't see these things as being in conflict. They may be in tension with each other from time to time, but we don't see them as being in conflict, and we think you can have both. We think you can live a rich, vibrant, engaged American secular civic life, and you can live a rich, engaged, dynamic Jewish life, and that actually those two things can nurture one another. That being, I'm going to use a phrase that I absolutely hate, but I can't think of anything better right now. I can't actually. Being an engaged Jew can make you a better and more engaged American, and being an engaged American can make you a better, more engaged Jew. And that these two things are not, they're occasionally in conflict, but they can coexist and actually mutually benefit one another, that we don't have to pick one or the other, right? And then in more or less the middle, and I'm going to go a little deeper here, you have the conservative movement, right, which is in some ways trying to take a little bit of each. But I think we frequently mischaracterize conservative Judaism because it's not, well, Reform doesn't work for me and Orthodox doesn't work for me, so here I'm going to, sit in the middle, right? So we're going to go a little deeper there. The idea, the differentiating factor between at least the 3 major kind of movements in the Jewish landscape has nothing to do with theology, right? Because theology actually is not a defining thing for Jews. That's why you have, tons of Jews who call themselves atheists. They're not, they're mostly agnostic, probably even some of the people on the call. You have tons of Jews who call themselves secular or cultural Jews. I don't know what that means. I know what people mean when they say that. They mean they're a Jew with God issues. It's called being a Jew, right? Because what one does or does not think about God is actually not what makes, this Jew Orthodox and this Jew Reform. I guarantee you, I could line up 10 of the most ultra-Orthodox black hat looking guys you've ever met in your entire life from some shul on the Brea, ask them what they think about God. You're going to get 12 different answers between the 10 of them, some of which I guarantee you are more liberal and progressive from a theological standpoint than some of the answers that people on this Zoom or who are members of Wilshire Boulevard Temple might give you, and vice versa, right? Because of the fact that we have this spectrum, right? There's no single Jewish theology other than monotheism, right? But nothing is prescribed as to what one must believe about that one God. So that's why there's such a wide spectrum of theologies that are a part of the Jewish kind of psyche. So theology is not what is the differentiator. And it's not even so much, although it manifests itself frequently in terms of Jewish practice, right? Well, they're Orthodox because, they're kosher, as my mother likes to say. Okay, they are not kosher, they're human. They keep kosher, right? They're not kosher, right? Or they, walk to shul on Shabbat, or, whatever. And well, they're conservative because they park 3 blocks away from the shul and pretend to walk to get there on Shabbat. Jody's laughing because it's true, right? Or they're reformed. It's reform, not reformed, right? They're reform because they can just pick and choose and do whatever they want, and they don't really have to do anything, right? No, actually, it's not necessary. It's not, differentiated based on practice, because I can find Reform Jews for you that aesthetically, you might say, oh, why is that Reform Jew so traditional? Because they're laying tefillin, or because they keep kosher, or because they come to temple every week, God forbid, right? Or what have you, right? Or wear kippah. And so clearly it's not necessarily practice, although sometimes it manifests itself that way. And a quick word about that, because what I just said about finding a Reform Jew for you that lays tefillin or goes to temple every week, much less every day. There are some Reform congregations that have a minyan every day that people come to. That seems like it's diametrically opposed, right, to what I referenced earlier, the Pittsburgh Platform, 1885, right? None of this is a part of Jewish practice anymore. We don't need any of this. Bruce, I see you, right? The Reform movement of the last, I think it's fair to say 50 years, slowly has began to embrace many aspects of more what was considered more traditional Jewish practice. And I think that's a function of 2 things, largely, maybe even 3. One, I think it's a function of comfort. I think that it took 100 years for Jews to feel comfortable enough in America to not be questioned for having dual loyalties, to have anti-Semitism, despite recent trends, declined drastically, to start to feel comfortable enough being different, comfortable enough, doing things that make it clear that Jews aren't just like, everybody else. So that's one piece of it. And the second piece, I think, is a deeper thinking about the fact that rituals that may have seemed, a century ago to be a little archaic, actually might have meaning and might infuse one's life with a deeper sense of spirituality, of holiness, of depth. And to say, and this is going to lead us to what I think the differentiating factors actually are between these movements, but to say, okay, no, we're not going to tell you you have to do this. I'm not going to tell you you have to keep kosher, but we might suggest to you that, eating in a mindful way, to put it in 21st century context, might have the ability to elevate your life and your spiritual practice and infuse your life with some sense of meaning and holiness. And that the Jewish answer to that is kashrut, not the only answer, right? But I'm not going to tell you that you need to do that because God said so, or because it's in the Torah, right? So there's an acceptance of a much wider variety of what traditionally would have been traditional Jewish practice within the Reform context and within the Reform movement. It's a much, I would say, broader tent in that sense. Bruce.
Okay, I have a question about the difference between Reform and Orthodox. How important in the differentiation between the Reform and Orthodox is the importance or the authority of Torah in developing an ethical life?
Yes. So that's exactly where I'm going next. All right. And Jeff, let me get you, and then I'm going to answer that, Bruce. Jeff, go ahead.
We talked about human nature and the qualities of, we all have a Jewishness about us, whether we call us that or practice it, since 80% of Jews are unaffiliated in any sense. But the idea is, it seems like it is the differentiation of what we accept as rights which define us. and the ability to eliminate the rites of orthodoxy, the habits and behaviors that are restrictive to what we consider our lifestyle or whatever you want to call it. But the idea is there's no focus on just the Jewish ethic in the sense of our behavior. And that's the one thing that defines all the groups, is that we all have the same ethic and need to act out the mitzvahs and the behaviors. And that doesn't seem to be part of the differentiation of the groups or the importance to each group.
Well, let me play through and answer Bruce's question, see if you feel the same way on the other side. So from my perspective, sorry, just checking the chat here. The differentiating factor, what is between these three major movements that I'm going to speak very briefly about Reconstructionist Judaism, is the way in which we view and our relationship to Jewish law. And whether or not we see Jewish law, the totality of it, as being binding upon us, as being something that we are obligated to, right? The way, whether we like it or not, we're, American, California civil law, the penal code is binding upon us, whether we like it or not, right? And the Orthodox answer is yes. The totality of Jewish law is binding upon a Jew, period. It is what governs the way you live your life. It is what you go to when there's a question in terms of how you ought to behave and what you should do, right? Because it is divinely given, divinely inspired, maybe, but it is, binding upon one's life, right? And just to be clear, without getting too into like a whole thing about Torah and rabbinic text, right? If you have a question about, kashrut or some aspect of Jewish law, you're not looking to the Torah. It's not there. You're probably not even looking to the Talmud, although maybe, but you're looking, to a medieval legal code, right? You're looking to Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, or Mishnah Torah, Shulchan Aruch, right? Or one of these legal codes from 15th, 16th century. So in the Orthodox world, the totality of Jewish law is binding, and because this is an important piece. And the notion is that at some point, around that time when these legal codes were codified, that the ongoing interpretation of that law, I should say differently, the ongoing evolution of that law stops. The interpretation obviously continues, but the ongoing evolution of that law stops. And the metaphor that conservative scholar, Rabbi Joel Roth taught, that I heard many, many years ago, is that if we imagine that Jewish law is a game of chess, and that at this point in time, 15th, 16th century, a glass dome is placed over the chessboard, right? And so the pieces can no longer be moved. And the thinking is that we can, in essence, come to any conclusion, answer any question that comes up today in 2020, excuse me, would that it were already 2021, that we can come to any conclusion, answer any question we need by looking at where the pieces were left when the dome was placed over the board. But we are no longer moving the pieces. We're no longer evolving this corpus of Jewish law and changing it. We are simply interpreting it to our current world, right? Pieces aren't being moved. That's the Orthodox world. The conservative movement. So here's where I hopefully don't get myself into any hot water. And Jody can chime in since she grew up and has been a dues-paying member of a number of conservative synagogues, as I know have a few others on the call. So the conservative movement, on paper, also says that the totality of Jewish law is binding. Now, I think there are a lot of conservative synagogues where if I stood up on the bima and said that, plenty of people would walk out the door and not come back, right? Which speaks to, and I'm not going to get into a whole commentary on the future of any Jewish movement, much less the conservative movement. I think it is fair to say that there's in many places, in many cases, a little bit of a disconnect in the conservative movement between kind of the mission statement and where the elite leadership in institutions are from an ideological standpoint, and where many of the people are from an ideological standpoint, right? But on paper, also the totality of Jewish law is binding, but we don't subscribe to this whole dome over the chessboard thing. Our rabbis today are just as capable of interpreting and evolving Jewish law as any rabbis in any period have been. And so we have continued to within the bounds of Jewish law, interpret and evolve that law to fit modernity. That's how you end up with women rabbis in the conservative movement. It's how you end up much more recently with LGBTQ rabbis in the conservative movement. However, those decisions had to be reached through a framework of Jewish law and figuring out a way that based on an evolving evolution of Jewish law, that could be acceptable, which maybe this is an oversimplification, I think is why the conservative movement came to both of those particular decisions, far more recently than the Reform movement, because they had to figure out a way to make it work from a legal standpoint, right? It's the same game that gets played out in American, jurisprudence, where, okay, well, this is the law. How do we get from the Constitution to whatever this law is today, right? It's this game of interpreting it. Again, because the thinking is still that the totality of Jewish law is binding. So on paper, and we live in a place where conservative Judaism, I think, is a little different than it is in a lot of parts of the country. But conservative Judaism is just, I don't even think it's fair to say in the middle between Orthodoxy and Reform. It's just a little to the left of basically modern Orthodoxy, right? It started as sort of with small r, basically, right? I would say a reformation of modern Orthodoxy of, okay, yeah, it's the same. We agree, but we're just going to keep interpreting law. And in the early days of conservative Judaism, you had a lot of conservative rabbis out there that went to Yeshiva University, didn't go to the Jewish Theological Seminary. And they come from this halachic world, this world of Jewish law. Okay, moving on to the Jody, please.
I was just going to say the interesting thing is that having been at Wilshire, having been at a lot of conservative synagogues, even truly some of my friends in Orthodox, like modern Orthodox synagogues, it's almost become congregants in those synagogues wanting their rabbis to be a conservative observer or, an Orthodox observer, almost disconnected from what choices they make as individuals. It's almost like, as long as my rabbi is keeping kosher or my rabbi is, it's what they want the leadership to be doing, not necessarily.
There's that line in Keeping the Faith, Jody, where Ben Stiller says that Jews want their rabbis to be the kind of Jews they don't have the time to be.
Yeah.
And Ed Norton says, and Catholics want their preachers to be the kind of Catholics that they don't have the discipline to be.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's.
And I don't think that's unique to conservative Judaism, personally.
I don't either, but at least as a conservative Jew, most the thing is like, oh, you can drive to synagogue, but most people drive. Most people don't keep kosher. Maybe they have a kosher kitchen at home, or but it is. I just find that so interesting that even when you align with a movement, it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do all those things. It means you're more comfortable with clergy who do those things.
I also think that the alignment with movements, and I was going to get to this in a minute, but I think that by and large, to overgeneralize a little bit, because there are obvious exceptions, but that many people find their way to whatever synagogue it is based on the fact that, well, I grew up at a conservative synagogue, so of course I'll join a conservative synagogue, right? Or I grew up in a conservative synagogue and that's the prayer book I know. Or, well, I live in the Palisades and so KI is at the end of my block. I don't really know what Reconstructionist Judaism is, but it seems fine and it's right here. So it's the neighborhood shul. Or, well, Wilshire is good because my kid can go to religious school on Wednesdays and that doesn't conflict with soccer on Tuesdays. So that's good, right? Or that rabbi bores me the least, or that rabbi inspires me the most. And it has nothing to do with ideology or movement. And that if you take the average congregant from KI, right, largest Reconstructionist shul in the country in the Palisades, you take your average congregant from Wilshire, you take your average congregant from, Sinai even, right? Or VBS is probably a better example, right? From VBS, 98%, the same in terms of Jewish practice, belief, ideology, right? So there are other factors that drive people to those synagogues. I'm really conscious of time, and I want to make sure we actually talk about reform quickly. So back to our metaphor: chessboard, domes, right? So we get to reform, and we're playing checkers. No, just kidding, right? We get to reform, and the reform stance is no, we don't believe that the totality of Jewish law is binding. We don't. And we believe that Jewish law is one of the things that we look to when making a decision, when determining how we ought to live our lives in a certain situation, but not the only thing. And there are times when it is the most appropriate thing to look to, and times when maybe there's something else that has a higher or more appropriate, thing to teach us. And the historic line that doesn't get used so much anymore in the movement is that Jewish law gets a vote, but not a veto. Right? It gets a vote, but not a veto in what we're doing. And I would argue that space is actually the most challenging of the three to be engaged in. Right? So you can tell me now, I fully reject this idea that Reform Judaism is buffet Judaism or pick and choose Judaism. There is pick and choose, but that requires knowing something about what you're picking and choosing from. And the idea that, I will quote my beloved teacher, Rabbi Richard Levy of blessed memory. Jody's going to smile, yeah. Who wrote a beautiful book about 15 years ago now called A Vision for Holiness, about a more recent statement of principles for the Reform movement that articulates much more aspects of traditional Jewish practice as being a part of Reform Judaism. But his thesis is that we are in dialogue with Jewish commandments, with Jewish law. And what that dialogue means is that it's a two-way street. And so we have the right to say, you know what? Turning the light switch on Shabbat doesn't mess up my Shabbos. But dialogue also means that we have to be open to saying, well, I've always eaten bacon cheeseburgers, but I wonder at this phase of my life, maybe if I chose to not, it would elevate my spiritual practice or infuse my life with a little bit more holiness. And that we are in an ongoing, ever-changing relationship with Jewish law, and that Jewish law are the tools by which we infuse and make our lives holy. Not the only tools, but our tools by which we infuse and make our lives holy. And at different phases in our lives, different mitzvot, different commandments may speak to us in different ways, right? That at this phase of my life, this kind of observance and ritual really, really was helpful to me. And you know what? 15 years after doing it 15 years, it actually doesn't do that for me anymore. But I started exploring this, and this infuses my life with more. But it is I would say in many ways, an engaged process that requires a level of intellectual thought and learning and engagement. Because I would say, you don't get to I keep coming back to kashrut because it's an easy example, I guess. You don't get to reject kashrut if you don't know anything about it and have never tried it. And so this sort of dialogue with Jewish law matters, and is, I think, I wrote in an article a long time ago now that that what defines Reform Jews is not practice, but perspective, right? Not practice, but perspective, not actually what we do. Because as I said, you can find Reform Jews that are going to do a bunch of stuff that you might think of as being Orthodox, right? But why they're doing it and how they got to a place to do it, right? Because you could probably find an exception, but a Reform Jew is not going to tell you that they're laying tefillin because it's a commandment and they have to, that's not, you could probably find an exception, but that's by and large not. They're going to say because it, is a moment for me and gets my day started on the right foot and helps me center myself, right? Quick word about Reconstructionist Judaism, because I don't want to leave it out. And again, there are other secular humanists, renewal Judaism, which we're not going to get into today. And I'll speak very generally and may likely misspeak. And I apologize to anybody who's watching this at any point if I say something that's not accurate about Reconstructionist Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism is a 20th century advent, not actually really created by Mordechai Kaplan, who was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, but created later based on some of his teachings. And the fundamental premise of Reconstructionist Judaism is a rejection of the notion of Jews as the chosen, as a chosen people. And I'll say what Rabbi Leder often says, that this idea of Jews as the chosen people is a very misunderstood idea. It doesn't mean better than anybody else. It doesn't mean, anything other than chosen for something, right? The same way, like if you have two kids, you choose one to do the dishes and one to take out the trash. One's not better than the other. But it is rejected in Reconstructionist Judaism to the point where, most notably in prayers that we would know, in the Torah blessings and in the Aleinu, the language is actually changed to reflect this idea. But the fundamental thinking is this idea that we are all on different paths to the same God, certainly in the Judeo-Christian world, right? And that Judaism is a better path for us, but not necessarily better for anybody else. And you're on the Muslim path and you're on whatever Christian path you're on, and that's all well and good and no problem. We don't think ours is any better, it's just better for us. My own assessment of Reconstructionist Judaism is that that's a beautiful statement, but it doesn't a movement make. It's a beautiful statement, but it doesn't a movement make, because of what I said earlier, which is that theology is not defining for Jews. So there's absolutely, in my opinion, no conflict, right? Rabbi Harold Schulweis, blessed memory, right? Senior rabbi at VBS for many, many years. I don't know how many times used to stand on the bima and say, I'm a Reconstructionist and I'm a conservative rabbi. I believe that we're all on different paths to the same God. I don't think Judaism is the best. It's just better for me, right? And there's no conflict with that statement. There's absolutely no reason why Reconstructionist Jewish ideology couldn't be a part of an Orthodox Jew's perspective, much less a Reformed Jew's perspective. So you don't need to join there doesn't need to be an entire movement necessarily, in my opinion, for folks with that ideology to feel like they have a home, which I think, again, just in one person's opinion, demonstrates why, across the country, you definitely see small Reconstructionist communities, but KI is the largest Reconstructionist synagogue in the country, which I think has a lot more to do with a very charismatic leader for a long period of time and geography. Right? I have cousins who are members of KI, and literally because they live at the top of the street that the synagogue's on, not because they know anything about Reconstructionist Judaism or really care. If they lived in Brentwood, they'd probably be members of Wilshire. So that's just a little bit about a Reconstructionist. The last thought that I'm going to say, and then I'll try to take 1 second for a question before I have to jump on another call, is one guy's opinion as to where we're going, not where any of the movements are going, but where we're going. And I if I had to guess, I would say within my lifetime, but almost certainly within my kids' lifetime. I think we are moving toward a world in which there are two kinds of Judaism. There's halachic Judaism and there's non-halachic Judaism. Halachic Judaism meaning Judaism in which Jewish law is binding, and non-halachic Judaism in which it's not. I have no idea what the names, or if there will be names for those things, are. Is the non-halachic kind going to be called Reform Reconstructionist? I don't know, right? I don't even know what that is, right? Is the halachic kind going to be called Orthodoxy or Conservative? I don't know, right? But that we already have that. And we already have that, and I think within the, and others can speak better to this, we already have that in the conservative world. We have people in the conservative movement thinking that the movement's too liberal and they're jumping ship to young Israel. And we have people on the left side of the conservative movement saying, well, you know, the religious school schedule at Wilshire is better, like, and the services are more or less the same. I really like Rabbi, you know, Feinstein, but, you know, right? So I don't know that there's a center there. So I think we're moving toward a world in which there's going to be there'll be spectrum within each. But in a world in which you're either a Jew that believes that Jewish law is binding, or you don't. And I think that, you know, those kinds of changes are slow to happen because of, and I alluded to this earlier, because of these large, gargantuan institutions in the form of both movements, the United Synagogue, the Union for Reform Judaism, their affiliated seminaries, right? Every movement has a monopolistic relationship with a seminary, right? If you want to be a Reform rabbi, you go to the Reform seminary. If you want to be a conservative rabbi, you go to the conservative seminary. There's Sukas is shaking her hand. There's a couple of newer seminaries that don't quite fit into that landscape, right? But these are large institutions that have vested interests in this movement or this denomination, right? There is AJRCA, absolutely, of which several of our clergy are alums. So I think it is changing, but I think institutions are slow to change and slow to fall away. I think what we're living through may precipitate it a little bit. But that's kind of what I got. I'll quickly go through the chat. I'm willing to be a couple minutes late to my next thing just to get through this. I'll quickly go through the chat. Moving to Israel, Laura, is your question about moving to Israel as a Reform Jew? Your Jewish practice is going to be irrelevant. The law of return, you have to have one Jewish grandparent to make Aliyah. Just for those who don't know, and that's actually, this is sort of morbid, but the reason that was the qualification to make Aliyah is because it's the same, it's the same qualification that the Nazis used to determine if someone was Jewish to die.
There was another question about converting to Judaism, just to help you scroll through the chat.
Yeah, I saw that. Happy to talk about the process of converting to Judaism in a different, at a different time. So you can reach out to me privately. I'm happy to talk about that. Anybody else? Jeff, yeah.
The comment that you made about chosen people needs to be changed to a choosing people.
Yes.
And choosing the ethical, moral behaviors that are necessary to be described in the best terms of being Jewish is the important element.
And I would say I left out, as I referenced Rabbi Leader talking about the idea, he says it's also about choosing to be chosen. Right?
Correct.
When your teacher calls on you, they're choosing you, but they're calling on you because you raised your hand.
And the sects really are just the element of your tolerance as to what you consider important actions, because Judaism, above all else, is an action-oriented religion. And choosing your behaviors, choosing your ethical choices is the essence, whether you labeled one or the other of the sects of Judaism as they exist today.
Absolutely. I apologize. Miriam, I apologize. I'm 5 minutes late for another Zoom, so I have to run.
Thank you.
This was great. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Miriam, how are you?
I'm good, Jeff. I'm very good. And how are you, dear?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. I hope